Welcome to the Faculty Forum Online, a program of the MIT Alumni Association. I'm Judy Cole, and I'm the EVP and CEO of the Alumni Association, and I will serve as moderator. Our viewers of today's conversation include MIT alumni, friends of MIT libraries, and the general public. Any MIT alumni who wish to ask a question, enter your first name, your location, and the question in the form on your screen, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. The general public is encouraged to share their thoughts on Twitter by using hashtag #MITFaculty. Our guest today is Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor Emeritus in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. Professor Chomsky is an author, political activist, and philosopher, and he created the field of modern linguistics, the scientific study of language. He's also the subject of the Chomsky Archive, a recently launched MIT Libraries project to preserve and digitize the lectures, personal papers, and materials he has donated to MIT's Institute Archives and Special Collections. Professor Chomsky, welcome. Could you start by telling us what you hope readers and researchers will draw from these historic items?
Well, the archives include everything I could think of, endless amounts of correspondence, hard copy up to maybe 20 years ago, then starts to be mostly electronic, books, papers, class notes for 60 years, notes for talks, lengthy transcripts of discussions, probably tapes of things like this. And what I hope people will be able to do is reconstruct some of the history of how both sides of my existence, both how the linguistics, cognitive science, modern philosophy have taken the shape they have, and on the other side, ongoing commentary on what's going on in the world. So lots of data in there.
No doubt. I'm sure it will provide a rich text of the evolution of your thinking. Questions are coming in now, and as we gather them, allow me to ask just a question or two of my own to start us off. As you may know, we've been doing these forums for years, and never have we had so much interest from viewers as for this one, nor so many testy responses. As a public intellectual, you've certainly sparked controversy. How do you decide which contemporary issues to address?
Well, it's a mixture. Partly it's just personal interest and background. Partly I try to evaluate what are the most humanly significant issues that we're now confronting, and some mixture of those two considerations.
So here's another question. You have been applauded for your boldness and clarity, and your many vigorous public debates are legendary. Is there a favorite debate that stands out, and do you have a favorite opponent, perhaps someone you vigorously disagree with but enjoy engaging with?
Well, actually, the people I most enjoy engaging with are in the so-called, what I think of as the professional side of my field. So discussions about the nature of language, the origin of human cognition and language, lots of lively discussions and debates about that, and those are pretty constructive.
So now we are getting them from our alumni. Bob in Leverett, Mass. asks, whoa, let me see here. Somehow this isn't scrolling properly. There we go. I value the insights I've learned from you, but every time I hear you speak, I feel depressed. How can we change feelings of helplessness into positive actions that can turn our governments around?
Well, the best way to do it, there's several ways. One is to pay attention to history. Things may look difficult and uncomfortable now, but they were much worse 50 or 60 years ago. So take where we're sitting, MIT, where we're all from. When I got here in 1955, the institute was virtually entirely white males, well-dressed, polite, deferential, relatively formal relations among people, faculty and students. You take a walk down the halls today, it's radically different. It's half women, maybe third minorities, informal relations, informal dress, which is in fact symbolic of the informal relations among people. Look at the bulletin boards, calls for engagement in all kinds of issues. At that time, there was virtually nothing. Now, that's happened all over the world, and it's a very positive development. It didn't happen by itself. It happened by a lot of difficult struggle. Yesterday, Martin Luther King Day, was a good time to recall a very substantial part of it. That was by no means easy, and there's plenty to go forward. If you look back beyond, there's kind of a trajectory of with relative progress over the centuries, last few centuries, in many respects. There's also regression, but the best reason for optimism is we've changed things before and we can do it again.
It seems to me there's a certain impatience in the MIT DNA that wants things to happen more quickly. So, but you're right. Putting it in perspective is what really...
Well, one of the difficulties in the United States is that there's very little continuity in activism. Everything begins from zero. So take, say, the Occupy movement. It began with, it just sprang up. No historical recollection, no few connections to anything that had happened before. You have to kind of learn everything from scratch. And along with that comes a feeling that we want quick victories. If you do have this sense of continuity and struggle, you know it goes back a long time. So take again the civil rights struggle. It kind of was sparked in around 1960 when several events, a couple of black students sat in a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Others joined, they were arrested, others joined them. Pretty soon you had freedom riders in the South, violence, tremendous courage, registering of voters, marches like Selma and so on. And finally some victories. But it didn't begin in 1960. It goes back to abolitionism. And that's the way life works. You're not going to get quick, you can get small changes, but major victories are going to take time.
So another alumnus, David in Jerusalem, asks, what influences and which teachers helped you form your current worldview, including your views on the Israeli-Arab disagreements?
Well, actually, that was the major concern of my life as a teenager. So there were individuals, of course, but I was very much involved as a teenager in what was then called Zionist activism. Now it's called anti-Zionist. It was the part of the Zionist, this is pre-1948, it was the part of the Zionist movement that was opposed to a Jewish state and was committed to some form of Arab-Jewish cooperation at the time within an effort to develop a cooperative economy of the kind that was in fact partially developing within Palestine at the time, the Jewish sectors of Palestine. And there were particular individuals who were influential, but it was mainly the simply engagement in the constant activism committed to those goals, and it continued from there.
So Luis in Massachusetts asks, do you feel your writing has influenced or directly impacted decisions made by policymakers? And what evidence, if any, do you see to support this?
The influence is often, the most significant influence is indirect. So take, say, the Vietnam War, major topic. I was very intensively involved in it through the 60s and 70s, and many others were too. In fact, MIT became one of the leading centers of opposition to the war, even resistance activities. What was the effect? Well, the effect, it had an effect on bringing the war to an end, very slowly, much too slowly, not until millions of people had been killed and several countries practically destroyed. But it did come to an end. If you look closely at how it came to an end, it traces back to the fact that there was so much opposition to the war engendered by these activities that the government was never able to call a national mobilization of the kind that was called during World War II, when people were really dedicated to the war effort. Well, a national mobilization is very good for the economy. If you take a look at what happened during World War II, I mean, you know, the war is a horror story. But if you just look at the economy, industrial production almost quadrupled. The Depression was ended. There were jobs for everyone. The basis was laid for very substantial technological and economic growth in the subsequent years because people were really committed to the effort. In the 1960s, you couldn't do that. There wasn't that kind of commitment. So what was fought was what was called a guns and butter war. You have to keep the population quiet, at the same time continue with the war. That's very harmful to the economy. And in fact, it led to what's called stagflation, stagnation and inflation. It became the internal economy began to suffer. In January 1968, there was a major uprising in South Vietnam, the Tet Offensive. Now that made it very clear to the decision makers, in particular in the business community, that this war was going to go on for a long time. At that point, a decision was made to begin to wind it down. Now, no one says the peace movement told the decision makers to wind it down, but the indirect activities of stimulating opposition, concern, dissent, protest, had the indirect effect of leading to that decision. And in fact, we have direct evidence for that. It's pretty obvious from what happened. But if you look, say, at the Pentagon Papers, the famous Pentagon Papers, the record there ends in mid-1968, a few months after the Tet Offensive. And if you look at those last few sections, they're pretty interesting. What happened is that the government, these are internal records, you know, so not intended to be read, but the government, the Johnson administration, wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops to Vietnam after the offensive. The military was wary; they didn't want to do it, and the reason was that they said that they would, if that happened, they would need troops in the United States for civil disorder control because of the extent of the protest and dissent among young people, among women, among minorities. They listed the groups they were concerned with. Well, that's a way.
Those days.
Yes, that's a way to influence policy.
Yeah.
And it happens over and over in complicated ways. I mean, it's not a matter of taking a trip to Washington and convincing the president that you should do so and so. You know, they know what you're going to tell them anyway. But there are indirect ways of bringing about results. Yesterday's commemoration of King is a good example. It wasn't a matter of Martin Luther King going to Washington and convincing Lyndon Johnson to pass the Voting Rights Act. A lot of activism took place for years, in fact going back centuries, but in the immediately preceding years there was very intensive struggle, activism, popular mobilization. It created a situation in which certain decisions were made.
This is very interesting. I have to tell you, it's a much more international set of questions than we've than we typically get. The next one is from an alumnus, Khalil, in Saudi Arabia. What role did the West and the regional powers play in distinguishing the Arab Spring outcries and flares? Do you think they will rekindle again?
Well, the Arab Spring took many different forms. It actually began in the last African colony, Western Sahara, about a month before the Tunisia the demonstrations and protests.
I didn't realize that.
Well, it's not discussed, but it's important that it's not discussed. There's one colony left in Africa, Western Sahara. It was Spanish. The Spanish left in 1975. It was supposed to go through decolonization under UN auspices, but Morocco invaded, and a war began, which continues between the indigenous population and the Moroccan invaders. Morocco transferred an enormous number of people into the territory, hoping to swamp referendum if it ever takes place. And this struggle continues right up to the Security Council. It's one of the cases where there hasn't been significant progress because there isn't popular activism and mobilization. That's quite significant. In cases where there has been, there was progress. Back in, I guess it was October, shortly before the Arab Spring broke out, there was a popular demonstration, a tent city, and set up in the main cities of Western Sahara by the Sahrawi indigenous population. And they were crushed by force very quickly. Went to the Security Council. It was blocked, mostly by France, which is a patron of Morocco, and that one ended. Then came Tunisia, then Egypt, then other places. And the effects varied. So in Tunisia, there has been significant progress. Again, it's mostly French influence. French tried to block it, but it did break out, and it continued. Egypt is a complicated matter. There, again, substantial achievements, but there's a sharp reversal. Egypt's now heading into a very dark period. Saudi Arabia, where the questioner is, as I'm sure the person knows, there were initial attempts at joining the Arab Spring, very mild protests. They were crushed by force instantly, and nothing ever happened. In nearby Bahrain, where struggles went on for a while, finally Saudi Arabia sent troops to quell the uprising. And Syria, of course, turned into a total monstrosity.
Yes.
Libya was torn to shreds. There's nothing left. So the question, what happened? Well, right now I think it's kind of in limbo. My suspicion is it's going to, I think there were substantial achievements despite the regression. And I think it probably lays the basis for something that will break out soon. I don't think the current regimes, mostly really dictatorial regimes, have the capacity to deal with the just demands of the population for freedom, for economic development, for some degree of social rights and so on.
The current situation seems unsustainable indefinitely. I mean, it's maybe a little longer, but hopefully not too much longer.
Right now, the region is being torn to shreds by the repercussions of the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, it's very devastating for Iraq, but it also set in motion a sectarian conflict which didn't really exist before. Take a look at Baghdad in the year 2000. Shiite and Sunni were intermingled. They intermarried. They lived in the same places. Sometimes people didn't even. It was kind of like knowing what Protestant sect your neighbor's in. Sometimes you didn't know.
Right.
Within a couple of years, it had turned into a raging war, and now tearing the whole region to shreds. That's going to be very hard to deal with.
Indeed, indeed. So our next question comes from Geneva, alumna Simone. What are the fundamental differences between spoken and invented languages, e.g. Elvish? And what are the main difficulties in inventing a language?
Well, the concept of inventing a language is very misleading. So take, say, the best known one, Esperanto. If you take a look at a grammar of Esperanto, it doesn't tell you the rules of Esperanto. Just as if you take a look at a grammar of Spanish, it doesn't tell you the rules of Spanish. Those almost nobody knows. Those are matters of discovery. To try to find the principles that are really operating when you and I converse is a problem like finding out what's going on in our visual systems when stimuli hit our retina and I see a person or a room or whatever. That's very you can't introspect into that. You don't know what it is. You have to discover it from the outside. Same is true of language. Now, Esperanto carries over. When people think they know Esperanto, what's really happening is they know language. Mm-hmm. They know their own language. They know something about common Romance languages, unconsciously and beyond the level of consciousness. Just like you can't figure out how your digestive system is working or your visual system or whatever. Mm-hmm. So the invented languages are really just the invention of extremely superficial elements of language, mm-hmm. like the choice of words or the choice of sounds or the decision what order to put the words in. Now, these are all facts about language, but they're extremely superficial. Mm-hmm. What's really happening, say, in our interchange is deep below the level of conscious awareness. And it's actually the topic of linguistics, mm-hmm. cognitive science, or the brain sciences to try to unearth it. But all that is simply taken over unconsciously when people say they're inventing a language. So what they're doing is actually filling out some of the superficial details of their actual linguistic knowledge.
Fascinating. I'm not sure I understood all of that, but it was really good. Michelle in Philadelphia, what do you think of the impact of the World Wide Web? What do you think is the impact that the World Wide Web has had on the English language?
My hometown, Philadelphia. I don't think it's had. Again, it's had a kind of an effect in the sense, in the way that teenage slang has an effect on the language. So there are some locutions that are used that weren't used otherwise, but languages are constantly changing in these pretty superficial respects. The web use of the web, especially texting and so on, has probably had some minor effects, but the language doesn't change.
It seems it's sort of informalized it somewhat in the same way that relations between people at MIT have become less formal over time.
Well, that's a process that's been going on for a long time.
Yes.
And it affects usage of the language.
Yes.
But it doesn't affect the language.
Ah, okay.
The language is the same whether you use it in formal discourse or mm-hmm. informal talk with your grandchildren.
Got it. So Eric in California asks, what are the long-term prospects for the U.S. economy? The standard of living has been maintained through consumer debt and asset bubbles, but these cannot continue indefinitely. What other options are there?
Well, actually, consumer debt did rise sharply in the early part of this millennium, but by now it's not very high relative to GDP. Problems with the economy are different. The problem is that during the what's called the neoliberal period, roughly the past generation, productivity has increased. Not quite as fast as before, but it has increased. On the other hand, it hasn't reached the population. Mm-hmm. For the majority of the population, it's been a period of relative stagnation or decline. So real male wages today are about at the level of the 1960s, even though productivity has gotten much greater. Mm-hmm. Wealth has been produced, but it's gone into very few pockets. The last decade, I don't remember the exact figures, but I think about 95% of the wealth produced, something like that, went to maybe 1% of the population. And the 1% that people talk about is misleading, because if you take a look at that 1%, it's heavily skewed towards 1/10% at the very
Right.
top.
Right.
So what's happened is an extreme maldistribution of wealth, stagnation, relative stagnation for much of the population, and limited opportunities for work. I mean, there's now, a lot of some praise for the fact that the unemployment rate has gone down, which is good but misleading, because one of the reasons it's going down is that people have just dropped out of the workforce.
Given up, yeah.
If you take a look at the proportion of the working population that has good full-time employment, still way below what it should be. I mean, this, the financial excesses of the last roughly, actually it goes back 20 or 30 years since deregulation started, but particularly the last decade have lost trillions of dollars of output. Now, those are the problems of the economy. You can see there's much discussion now about the minimum wage, but some things are overlooked. If you go through the rapid growth periods, 1950s and 60s, kind of a sometimes called golden age of the economy, the minimum wage tracked productivity, which it should. As productivity increases, the minimum wage increased. When you get to about the mid-70s, they start to separate. Productivity goes up, minimum wage flattens, which means it goes down relatively.
Right.
If the minimum wage had continued at the rate of the 50s and the 60s, it would now probably be about $20 an hour or something like that. And that's and that of course affects everything else. As minimum wages go down, so do others. And we have a period of, if you take a look at the economy today, you can see really deep failures. I mean, there's a huge amount of work that has to be done. I mean, just drive around the city, the infrastructure's a wreck, the schools are underfunded, the health system is an international scandal, way too expensive for what's achieved. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done. Lots of people want to do the work. There's plenty of resources, and it's not happening. The system is so dysfunctional that massive capital resources, great willingness to work, vast amounts of work to be done can't be put together. That's a serious, I mean, we can think of ways out of that, but the fact that it's happening is a major problem. Consumer debt, in contrast, is not a major problem.
Right. Well, that actually has probably gone down more recently anyway.
It's now within reasonable limits. It did increase briefly during the housing bubble, basically.
So I was hearing on the radio this morning about the legislation around creating super PACs and the ability of anonymous donors to support different political lobbying efforts. It seems to me that might be part of the causes of some of these problems that you're talking about, getting it all together.
There is a very fundamental problem with the functioning of the democratic system. Actually, it's a very good study of the last election, the midterm election, by two leading political scientists, Walter Dean Burnham and Thomas Ferguson. They're the major students of electoral politics. And the results that came out are pretty startling. It turns out that voting participation in much of the country is about at the level of the early 19th century. Wow. That's a time when voting was restricted to propertied white males.
That's scary.
It's very scary. And what they conclude is, plausibly, people have just given up on the political system. Yeah. They know that it doesn't do anything for them. And if you look at other studies, you see the details. So, for example, an important book came out a couple of years ago by Martin Gilens, I think he's at Princeton, it's called Affluence and Influence. It's just a study of the relation between public opinion and public policy. There are many such studies. This is one. What he found, which is what others find, is that for a large majority of the population, roughly 70% at the lower part of the income scale, they're effectively disenfranchised. Their representatives simply pay no attention to their opinions.
Right.
As you go up the scale, you get a little bit more influence. When you get to the very top, that's where policy is made. And that's related to closely related to what you brought up. The elections are basically bought.
Right.
And those who are put into office by the funding, the massive funding that's of concentrated wealth, are responsive to that constituency. Actually, this goes way back. It's nothing new. They go back about a century. The famous campaign manager, Mark Hanna, he was once asked, what are the important things for running a successful campaign? And his answer was, he said, there are three things that are important. The first one is money. The second one is money. And I've forgotten what the third one is. That was over a century ago. And it's gotten much more extreme, particularly in the light of recent Supreme Court rulings.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump around a little bit here and stick with the international flavor. Tugral in Nairobi, Kenya, asks, media powerhouses around the world use words and language of exclusion and division, such as martyr, religious, and terrorist. Do you think social media has the capability to counter the divisive language used by mass media?
They can, in the same way that popular activism can counter public decisions that impose repression and oppression. So social, say terrorism, social media can, the term is used in a almost strictly Orwellian manner. Terrorism means the terrorism that they commit against us, but not what we commit against them. And social media can, we've seen this this last couple of days with regard to the Charlie Hebdo affair.
Yes.
It was a terrorist act. There are others that we've committed that are very similar, that don't even enter into the discussion. Some of them even worse. For example, in the U.S., NATO bombed and destroyed, put off the air a Serb television station during the attack on Serbia in 1999, and killed 16 journalists, about the same as Paris. And there was a reason. It was producing information supportive of the government we were attacking. Okay, that's not called terrorism. We did it. A couple of years later, the U.S. Marines invaded the town of Fallujah in Iraq. You take a look at the newspapers, just the days of the invasion, very positive reporting. It was described as a noble, enterprise, still described that way. It's actually one of the worst war crimes of the millennium. First day of the invasion, you take a look at the New York Times, there's a picture on the front page of, which is described in the caption. The picture is patients lying on the floor of the general hospital. The troops invaded the general hospital, which is a war crime, took the patients out of the beds, put them on the floor, tied their hands behind their back, same with hospital personnel and so on. There were questions from reporters, and there was a reason. They said the hospital was a propaganda agency for the rebels. What was the propaganda? It was producing casualty figures. Well, when we do that, that's considered fine. In fact, there's a best-selling movie now, a famous movie that glorifies some of these things. If they were to do that to us,
it would be terrorism.
Oh my God, beyond terrorism.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of thing that can be overcome by popular engagement, and social media are just one form of popular engagement.
So going back, let me see, where was I? Jane in Cambridge. How do you write, and how have you managed to be so productive? Was it a conscious goal for you to be prolific? Do you believe that it's still possible to be politically active while still climbing the ranks of academia?
Sure. There's no special trick. It's just hard work. It's something anybody can do if they want to. You have to decide how you want to spend your time. It takes time from other things. Can't help but doing that.
Right. There's
But
still only 24 hours in a day.
Only 24 hours, but it's very fulfilling in many ways.
So Jonathan in California asks, do you have any observations or predictions about the recent warming of relations between the U.S. and Cuba?
Well, that's an interesting development. We should look a little bit at the background. The U.S. has been extremely isolated on Cuba. You take a look at the votes at the United Nations. Every year there's a vote in the General Assembly on the U.S. embargo against Cuba, basically a blockade. The votes are 180 to 3, United States, Israel, and the Marshall Islands, or something like that. That goes on year after year. It's gotten so extreme. A very interesting development has taken place in the Western Hemisphere in the last 10 to 15 years. For the first time in 500 years, literally, the countries, mainly of South America, have begun to extricate themselves from imperial domination. In the last century or so, that means U.S. domination. They've begun to move towards integration. They've moved towards independence. The U.S., one sign of it is the U.S. doesn't have a single military base left in South America. And they've begun to confront some of their very serious internal problems. One consequence of this is that the U.S. has lost its influence in the continent. If you go back to, say, 1945, right at the end of the Second World War, the U.S. was able right away to call a hemispheric conference in Mexico, where the U.S. virtually dictated what was called an economic charter for the Americas, designed very explicitly to keep the continent as a exploitable resource base for U.S. industry and enterprise. Can't conceive of doing that now. In fact, the last hemispheric conference, the U.S. and Canada were virtually excluded. And the next one, they may be literally excluded. That's the background for the Obama's move towards Cuba. One of the several issues on which the U.S. has been isolated in the hemisphere is its refusal to allow Cuba to enter into the hemispheric system. Mm-hmm. The rest of the hemisphere is in favor of that and has been for a long time.
Well, and haven't some of the South American countries been ignoring our blockade? And
they try to ignore it, but you can't really ignore it. Mm. I mean, the U.S. has been very punitive about the blockade, not just South America. So, if Sweden, take a real case, sends medical equipment somewhere that's using nickel that was gotten from Cuba, that can be punished under the U.S. embargo. It's a very punitive system.
Wow.
And it's been, of course, extremely harmful to Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
But on top of that, going back to terrorism, the U.S. tends to forget that beginning with Kennedy, the U.S. launched a very serious terrorist war against Cuba. I mean, what people talk about is attempts to assassinate Castro. Yeah, they existed, but that wasn't what it was about. It was blowing up petrochemical plants, killing a lot of people, sinking ships in the harbor, shelling hotels, biological, probable, it's not certain, biological warfare could be, it's not certain. A very serious attack. That's kind of out of our history, but it's in real history. And that's, again, part of the background that went on into the 90s. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we're going to, we're running out of time here, but we have time for just one or two more questions, I think. I think this is an interesting one. What do you think is the greatest tool in demilitarizing our economy and our culture?
The human will. It's the greatest tool for any change. Take, say, nuclear weapons. There are now plans to spend about $1 trillion in the coming decades to upgrade the nuclear weapon system. That's a tremendous threat to survival. I mean, it's kind of a miracle that we've survived the nuclear age. If you look at the record, there have been case after case where a war came very close through inadvertence. So just take a recent case that was just discovered, from archival research. In the early 1980s, this is one of many, incidentally, in the early 1980s, the incoming Reagan administration decided to probe Russian air and sea defenses by simulating attacks, including nuclear attacks, to try to determine how they would react and so learn about their defensive systems. They also declared a nuclear alert intended for the Russians to know it so that they would take it seriously. Well, this was a very tense moment, it turns out. Pershing missiles were being installed in Western Europe. They have a 5 to 10 minute flight time to Moscow. Of course, Russia was completely surrounded by missiles, Turkey, everywhere. The Star Wars, so-called SDI program, was announced. Now, that's understood on all sides to be basically a first strike weapon. The Russians took it very seriously. Newly released archives indicate that there was a major war scare, which was not well understood, but it's worse. Just about a year ago, again, archival information revealed that in this very tense period, the Russian automated systems, which make huge numbers of errors, ours do too, detected a major missile attack from the United States. And the protocol is that information is supposed to be transmitted to the high command, which then order a retaliatory strike. Well, there's one human being, his name is Stanislav Petrov, who received the automated information and decided not to transmit it. And that's why we're here to talk about it.
Wow.
And we don't know how many cases like that there are, but there's a recent study that came out in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, just studying whatever data they have. A lot of it's classified, but whatever data they have from the U.S. systems, I think from about 1980 to 1983, that period, they found probably hundreds of cases where there were accidents that could have blown up, and they assume that it continues. Well, this is quite apart from cases where there really were open confrontations, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or what might be building up in Ukraine now, and others. That's constant. In the face of that, we're now upgrading our missile systems. Just a couple of days ago, the Russians announced that they are withdrawing from a pretty successful agreement in which the U.S. helped them eliminate dangerous nuclear weapons stores that they had after the Cold War. They're pulling out of it because of the conflict in Ukraine. That's hazardous. And this is a case where we know, at least we know the answer of how to end the problem, get rid of nuclear weapons. And in fact, we're committed to that by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we're going the other direction.
It's like that old movie, War Games, where the only winning move is not to play.
Well, the article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists starts off by talking about black swans, highly improbable events that do nevertheless take place. And what it says is a nuclear war is a black swan. We won't know that there is one until we're all dead.
Oh, well, going back to the person who asked about how to feel better afterwards. That's kind of a sad note to end on, but I'm afraid we must because
Well,
we're
actually,
out of
it's an
time.
optimistic note to end on.
Okay.
And the reason is that this is one problem that at least we know how to solve. There are others equally serious where it's not clear that we know, like environmental catastrophe.
Well, that's very true. So on behalf of the MIT Alumni Association, thank you, Noam, for your insights, and thanks to our viewing audience for joining us. For more information on the Chomsky Archive at MIT Libraries, visit libraries.mit.edu/Chomsky. We encourage you to continue discussing these topics on our blog, Slice of MIT, by following the link that will appear on your screen, and on Twitter using the hashtag MITFaculty. You can also view an archive of past faculty forums online by visiting the Learn section on the Alumni Association website. Please join us next month for another session of the Faculty Forum Online.